Hello and welcome to Socialism Survival Podcast number 4. As always, this is Alex, and my subject for this week is everyday survival and the story of Golden Calf. But first, let me do some virtual housekeeping. I'd like to invite you to check out my website, socialismsurvival.com. At the top of the homepage, you'll find links to my blog, forum, podcast, and contacts. It's all live pages where you actually can do something. Please take time to join the forum and leave there your comments or suggestions. I'll appreciate if you'll contact the show either by sending email or by leaving your voice message right from website using a cool feature called Google Voice. It is right there at the bottom of contacts page. I'd like to share with you a little bit more about myself. I am a musician and songwriter, and for many years since I was doing recordings, my studio equipment was sitting in the boxes. And I'd like to thank someone like Jack Spirko from the survivalpodcast.com for motivating me to do something and to take not only my equipment but also my experience out of the box. Since I'm friendly with digital recording and web setting, it was much easier for me to start podcasting. A little bit about music I'm using in my podcast. All music compositions you hear are mine, except intro, which is modernized rock version of Soviet anthem that I played on my synthesizer keyboard, and a few Macintosh GarageBand sound bites. But especially when you hear harmonica, that's mine. Before I proceed with this show, I need to say or to use a disclaimer. I have to warn you that this podcast contains some strong descriptions of events and places that may be inappropriate for minors and for sensitive people with mental and heart problems. Therefore, listeners' discretion is advised. And now, back to my subject. Living under socialism was everyday challenge. Many challenges. I'll try to cover in this podcast some of them, as much as I can. I will continue sharing with you in other podcasts about other challenges that will not fit in this podcast. Let's start. We all need work to survive. Oh yes, in Soviet Union we all had right to work. If you could survive your work. Everyone had to work or could end up in jail for undermining Soviet economy. You see, just being lazy was a crime. Such things as self-employed, entrepreneur, businessman simply didn't exist. Instead of being farmers, people were bound to collective farms known as kolkhoz for life. During my lifetime, when Brezhnev died and KGB chief Andropov replaced him as Communist Party Secretary General, people were arrested and interrogated for simply standing idle on the street while others worked. Soviet Union didn't have unemployment. That was the problem of the rotten capitalism, as we were taught. So, what was the problem that we had? It was the pay. All salaries had fixed rates. Only communists deserved to hold highly paid positions. Pay raises and bonuses also were fixed with the idea not to overpay us. In order to survive, people had to steal from their workplaces or do some side work in addition to your main job. One thing that survived from the past was temporary contractor's job. I know some people who managed to contract all the time, year around. 1 month building barns for collective farms, next saving harvest at the same farms. Christians who otherwise were excluded from highly paid jobs often made excellent contractors teams that were highly respected by kolkhoz directors. They, despised by the socialist system, were the best workers. They didn't drink alcohol, didn't steal, didn't take smoking breaks, and therefore did fast quality job. Other people whom I knew were car owners who used their cars to make extra cash as private taxi drivers, even if it was illegal and could lead to car being confiscated. Their creative survivalist minds saved them from being caught. For example, they would take passengers on the condition that they will act as relatives if car was stopped by police. They had to be extremely cautious to avoid taking undercover police as passengers. Talking about transportation, we arrived to another problem: getting to and from work. Few could afford to own a car or bike. At the peak hours, buses, trolleys, and trams were so packed that drivers were unable to shut down the doors. People not just touched each other, they were smashed into each other. Some indecent people, like sex offenders or predators and thieves, took advantage of it too. I know girls suffered a lot being abused by sex perverts who used such situation for their satisfaction. If the girl was alone, often the predator, in the heat of his fantasies, would follow and attack her on the way from a bus stop. But not all men were so immoral. They all were captives of the developed socialism transportation, driving them nuts on the road to communism. What could young innocent lady tell someone when his head was simply trapped between her breast or whatever? And how you could blame him? for, let's say, involuntary erection of deep feelings. Please forgive me such details. It is just a naked truth of Soviet reality. Sometimes I had to pray, asking God to forgive and cleanse me from something similar that absolutely wasn't my choice. Maybe if you would survive similar to that, you would fully understand. I wish my kids never experience the socialism hell I went through. So these little details, they are just flowers comparing to what you will find out in the future podcasts. This was just socialism survival in a form of 30 minutes bus ride. Plus, add to that viruses, germs, bugs selecting you as their victim. I remember being terrified that the bus crowd might jam me into gypsies who were famous lice hosts. That was bus line number 13. Next, I'd like to describe public toilets as another unique place of everyday Soviet socialism survival. Here in America, you call it restroom. You say rest. It sounds so peaceful. You say room, and it sounds so secure. Not so with Soviet public toilet. There was no place to rest, and it was far from being secure. I mean it literally. No seats, no individual cabin with the door that locks. You couldn't find there a paper roll, maybe just a piece of newspaper, Pravda, which means truth in English. Of course, full of communists' lies. Or maybe a piece of newspaper, Truth, which means work, to remind you that all you are entitled from Communist Party for your hard work is that stinky pit and that piece of a newspaper. And that had also to remind you that Soviet propaganda will find you even there. But not only propaganda could reach you there. Pedophiles and sodomites too. I remember when I was a young boy, maybe 13 years old, I was sitting there. If you can call that sitting, you actually had to squat over the hole. One middle-aged, nice-dressed man stood right in front of me and then quickly leaned towards me and reached with his hand, trying to grab whatever he saw there. Thanks God, I reacted fast, hit his hand hard, and yelled. That scared him off, giving me a few seconds, enough to escape. Are you out of your mind? I'm talking to you, Americans, who voted for socialism. Do you really want to lose your peace and security? You heard that right. First, you lose your mind to socialism, and then your peace and security. And in return, you'll get public toilet. That's how we call that in Russian. A place rightfully deserved by those who in one smash decided to overturn glorious American history, the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, the Bill of Rights. All these precious documents will end up in the place I just colorfully described if American proletariat will be allowed to establish their dictatorship in this country. Remember, if communism was that good, like they say, God would have chosen it as his religion, and that religion would choose God as their God to worship. Instead, they have always chosen the man as their object of worship, singing praises to their great leader. It was happening then, and it is so now. Sorry, I slipped back into propaganda subject, but that's just because it was the most oppressive everyday attack on our souls. Let's move on to my next everyday survival topic: surviving food shortages. Although I will dedicate another podcast in the future solely to this subject, at this time I'd like to outline something related to everyday food survival. I remember a lot of times our ability to simply go and buy food was limited by rationing. First, we had to get some food coupons or vouchers from acorn-like community organizers. Then go to the store and stay there for hours in the line to simply buy a limited amount of butter or sugar or bread or flour or milk or sour cream or other basic food. We didn't have something like Walmart or Walgreens or Safeways or Publix. Let me repeat what I said in one of my previous podcasts, that all this was happening in the Ukraine, former Soviet Republic, where I was born and lived most of my life, that has so rich soil, which, if well managed, could feed whole Europe. Even Nazis during World War II loaded railroad carts with Ukrainian soil to take back to Germany. But because all the land was owned by the Soviet state, people, especially in the villages, were enslaved by the socialistic government. And as you may know, slaves, motivated by the stick, tend either to produce less or to escape. I don't remember exactly chronological order of the events, but at some point after the war with Nazi Germany, villagers finally were allowed to have passports, and that means to move more freely around. And so many young people left for the cities. Trying to keep people by the land, government allowed people to use the land next to their homes. No, it was not giving land as ownership, but kind of a free rent. And not to get rich, but to keep slaves alive. However, being God's people and understanding that all the earth belongs to Almighty, as it is written in Psalm 24, verse 1, which I use as my weekly Bible verse. The Lord owns the earth and all it contains, the world and all who live in it. And we were thankful to Him for the access to the piece of His land, which He generously provided for our survival. Next to our house, on the outskirts of a big industrial city, we diligently used our hands, shovels, and water hose to grow our own food. Also, our grandparents allowed us to grow a whole year's supply of potatoes on their village lot as we helped them too. You see, family ties are very important for survival. Of course, we didn't experiment with unknown fruits and vegetables. Rather, we preferred something that could be harvested in large quantities, that was widely used and could be well preserved for at least a year. Take tomatoes, for example. We ate them fresh, preserved in glass jars with marinade, pickled green tomatoes in a wooden barrel, processed into a juice and paste needed a lot for a famous Ukrainian borscht. We had underground cool storage with the sections for potatoes, carrots, and beets had their section and they were covered with sand and shelves for glass jars. In a separate podcast, I'll talk more on growing and preserving vegetables, fruits, etc. This time I am more a storyteller. And the next story is about a golden calf. Our grandparents had a cow, E-I-E-I-O, and from the cow was born a calf, E-I-E-I-O. And Grandpa would say to our dad, E-I-E-I-O, take this calf and raise for meat, E-I-E-I-O. It's my version. My daughter loves the American version, as you know that. So we had moo moo here and a moo moo there. That calf was running everywhere. Spring, summer, and fall, we boys had two duties concerning that calf. First, every morning we had to take him for hard to find green spot that would be his pasture for a day. At sundown, we brought him back home. Second duty was to collect more grass for a winter. We spent many hours trying to find grass to fill our bags. I remember well how I was crawling on my knees at our school's soccer field, pulling out grass with my bare hands. That was everyday duty for us boys aged 8 to 13. When in the midwinter that calf was hammered down and later found in a bowl of borscht, that piece of meat was as precious for me as gold. Now you understand why I called him Golden Calf. One evening, I think it was November, I was taking him home from a pasture, holding in my hands a rope tied around his neck. Approaching home, he got very excited and ran fast, literally dragging me on the field. Not so joyful ride for me, though. I had to release the rope when he got on the road in front of our house. The next moment, he was struck by the bike. He survived the accident as well as bike driver, but his health rapidly deteriorated, and soon in December, first snow in our backyard turned red. The golden calf gave his life so that guys like Alex would survive socialism and tell you this story that has bigger picture. We all glorious Soviet people were forced to crawl on our knees to feed the golden calf of socialism. Some of us refused, and some lives were mercilessly dragged across the field called Soviet reality with the conditions of developed socialism. At that time, American president met with Soviet Secretary General, and in one of the meetings they decided to draw each other portraits. First, Soviet leader showed his picture, and there was American with big ears. Why my ears are so big? American president asked. You hear too much because your spies are everywhere. You know what we do before even we know that. Next, American showed his drawing, and there was Soviet leader with two breasts. What do you mean by that? Secretary General questioned. With this breast, American pointed, you feed developing countries, and with that, other socialist countries. And how I feed my people? Well, remember, we agreed not to draw below the waist. That was my Russian joke of the week. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you like Socialism Survival Podcast, please go to iTunes Store and rate it. That will be a great help for me. Also, please follow me on Twitter. I have Twitter link on my website. And join me on Facebook. Just look there for Socialism Survivalist. And please remember, this podcast presents a frank description of socialism and is your learning tool on how to resist and survive socialistic threat in the country you love. May God bless you. God bless America and the world He created.